To transmute an emotion, as I said, you can't have the motivation be to get rid of something. To transmute an emotion is an act of love. And maybe that'll become a little more clear as I describe this. So when you reverse the normal conditioned trajectory, which is to move away from something that's unpleasant, instead of moving away from unpleasant emotion or energy, you actually, the opposite trajectory is a trajectory where you're moving towards it or into it. I think of it as you're in an attitude of greeting it. You don't greet something you want to get rid of, you see. So your greeting is an act of it's something that has a benevolence to it. There's a tenderness to it. It's an act of love to greet something, to open to it, to welcome to it. It starts to close the distance between you and the emotion and the feeling. So to have that attitude of greeting it, you're allowing it into your atmosphere. You're allowing it into your company, right? Even if it may seem to be overwhelming, often emotions seem to be overwhelming because you're not actually greeting them. You're not allowing them into your company. They may be overwhelming you, but the overwhelm is actually because there's somewhere at a fundamental level you're rejecting their base energy. You're trying to push it away. And when you reject it or try to push it away, it makes it feel more and more and more overwhelming. So to greet an emotion is to start to collapse that distance. And you greet someone with a sense of warmness, right? When you greet something or someone, it's a movement of warmness. It's a movement of reaching out. It's an act of love, or at very least interest. Now, when you start to greet an emotion, when you really start to close the gap between you and the emotion, then you start to experience that as a type of energy. You get very, very intimate with the actual experience of it. And the actual experience of an emotion is actually the experience of the energy of it, right? So you have to get very close. You have to collapse that distance to begin to experience it in the way I'm talking about. Now, when you start to collapse the distance, when you start to greet it in a very quiet way, there's nothing analytical about this. It's not an intellectual process. If you really have had some spiritual shift, you know the emotion doesn't define you, so it shouldn't scare you. If it doesn't define you, then what are you afraid about? Why are you afraid of greeting it, of coming close to it? Do you see what I mean? If it's not really ultimately, it doesn't limit you, then there really shouldn't be any hesitation in what I'm talking about, in greeting it. So when you can fully greet it, then you actually literally allow yourself to become it. So take a very often a conflicted kind of emotion like anger. People are usually afraid of their own anger. So they're afraid to greet it. They're afraid to get close to it. They're afraid to really meet it. They see it as threatening, as uncomfortable, and they're afraid of being taken over by it. But we're not taken over by something that we actually approach consciously, that we actually greet. We're taken over by things that we're resisting, that we're trying to run away from. That's what you're taken over by. When you greet something, when you're totally conscious, when you're completely present for it, it can't take you over. And so you're giving up any kind of separation from that energy, from that emotion. You're relinquishing your otherness, your separation. You're allowing yourself to become it I don't mean that you're, by becoming it, it means you're going to express it. I also don't mean by becoming it that you're, of course, trying to get rid of it. I think that's obvious. But sometimes when I say to become an emotion, people then think that, okay, that means I'm going to express it. You know, I'm going to yell, I'm going to be rageful. When you do that, you're actually trying to let off the energy. You're actually trying to get away from it. To greet something is to completely close the distance. When you completely close the distance in such a way that, in a sense, you become that energy, but you're becoming it consciously instead of unconsciously. That's the key. That's the difference. When you're resisting, the energy will grab hold of you anyway, and you'll become it, but you'll become it in a completely unconscious way. You'll just feel like you're swept up with it. You'll feel like you're the victim of it. Maybe in a big, obvious way, or even in very subtle ways. So you actually allow yourself to start to become that energy on an energetic level. Now, when you're doing that, you may get all sorts of, there may be little moments of insight, there may be memories, there may be, of course, often your sort of endless narrative, your story, in other words, that keeps that energy in place will often, want to keep, your mind will want to pull you away from the direct experience of the emotion into the thought about it. Because if you're in the thinking about it, the story, then you just keep spinning and spinning and spinning. And you never really greet the energy. So to have the capacity to greet it is a very intimate thing. You have to have the capacity to be quite still and quiet and have a precision about greeting it. There's nothing haphazard about it. It's very precise. Even with an emotion that's really big, like anger or maybe a sort of confusing, all-consuming depression or whatever it is, that you're meeting it in a very precise way. You're getting to know its energy in a very intimate way. You're literally giving yourself to it, but not in the sense that you become unconscious. By giving yourself to it in the way I'm talking about, you actually, the energy becomes, the energy of the emotion becomes conscious. And you start to get to know its territory energetically, and you will get to know its territory also intellectually, because you'll hear the ideas, you'll hear the belief structures that hold it together, that seem to justify it. You'll get to know its territory. You're not trying to solve anything, you see. If you're going to transmute something, you're not trying to solve it, you're not trying to get rid of it. This is an act of love. You're there as an act of love, not to get rid of something. So when you really meet something in this way, which is very precise, but you're meeting the what isness of the moment. This moment as it is. And to meet this moment as it is not what most people think it is. To meet this moment as it is requires that you give yourself completely and utterly to this moment as it is. That sounds simple. It sounds like a small thing. But to give yourself to any moment as it is, completely as it is something that very few people even have any interest in, much less can really pull off. Because the resistance to the as-isness of any moment is usually so great. As I said, this is not something for the faint at heart. This is not for people who simply want to get rid and solve all of their emotional or intellectual turmoil. It's not somebody who's just trying to feel better. I'm not talking to them. Will not work for that. In fact, I'm not even interested in that. This is something different. This is an act of love. This is bringing liberation to everything. So you meet something, the as-isness of it. You get to feel, you get to sense its territory. It's emotional territory, it's energetic territory, it's intellectual territory. You get to know its territory. You're not doing anything with what you see and what you experience. You're just seeing it. You're just experiencing it. That way you get very, very much into its territory, into its what it really is. When you start to enter into an emotion in this way, when it starts to reveal itself as a certain pattern of energy, at a certain point, without you trying to do it, what starts to happen is a certain sort of flow starts to happen. Becomes a fluid quality that starts to come into the experience.